They say the frontier has a way of swallowing a manhole, and on that late summer evening, the wind seemed hungry enough to prove it true. The sky burned red as a forge, and a dust storm rolled across the open range like a beast waking from sleep. Fences rattled, cattle bawled, and in the middle of that rising chaos rode the man folks whispered about in low voices. Elias Crowe, the rancher who'd forgotten how to feel. His hat brim cut the storm in half as he fought to drive a skittish steer back toward the corral. Every movement was sharp, practiced, automatic. There was no fear in him, no anger, no hurry. Just a hollow sort of duty, the kind of man clings to when he's lost everything else. The dust stung his eyes, but it didn't matter. Nothing had really mattered for 3 long years. Not since the night he buried his wife. With a final crack of his reins, Elias chased the last steer through the gate and slammed it shut. The storm howled as if frustrated by the victory, ripping at his coat while he dismounted and tied up his horse. The ranch, Crowe Ranch, though no one called it that anymore, stood silent behind him. Boards weather gray, porch sagging. A house that once glowed warm as a hearth fire now looked cold enough to freeze the sun. He walked toward it without hesitation, without interest, without emotion. But fate has a strange sense of humor. By the time he reached the porch, another dust cloud appeared on the horizon. Not from the storm this time, but from the main road. A wagon creaked toward the ranch, wheels groaning like old bones. He paused, squinted. A lone figure sat at the reins. The wagon stopped in front of him, and out stepped a woman with a steady gaze and travel-worn boots. Clara Mayfield. She brushed dust from her coat, lifted her chin, and said with a calm that cut through the wind, "I hear you're needing a hand around this place." Elias studied her. Something in her presence, gentle yet forged in fire, made him shift his stance. But he didn't speak. Silence had become his only language. Clara didn't flinch. "I can cook, stitch, drive cattle. I don't scare easy." No tremor in her voice. No hesitation. Just truth laid bare between them. Behind her, the storm coiled itself around the horizon like a rattler preparing to strike. And maybe it was the thunder rolling in, or maybe it was something deeper, but Elias felt a flicker of something he didn't recognize at first. Unease. Memory. A pulse waking in a heart buried too long. Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and her eyes softened with a knowing only widows understand. "You don't have to talk," she said quietly. "Just tell me if you'll let me stay." Elias didn't answer, but somewhere out there in the dusty dusk, the wind whispered a secret only legends remember. That day, the rancher's life changed, and he never saw it coming. Folks in town said it was the first time anyone had seen smoke rising from Crowe Ranch in months. Not chimney smoke, cook fire smoke. A sign of life, a sign of change. And the old-timers leaning against the saloon rail muttered that it had everything to do with the stubborn widow who arrived like a gust of fresh wind through a rotted doorframe. Clara Mayfield had been on the ranch only 2 days, but already she moved through it as if born to its dust and silence. She swept out the kitchen, mended a sagging window shutter, and polished rust from tools that hadn't been touched since Elias stopped caring enough to try. She made no fuss, no demands, and spoke only when needed. But her presence, quiet yet unyielding, had begun pressing against the walls Elias had spent years building. Elias watched her from a distance, always from a distance. The way she carried herself, shoulders strong but gaze gentle. The way she refused to tiptoe around him, even when most men in the territory avoided him like a wounded mountain lion. There was grit in her smile, steel in her spine, and memories behind her eyes that ran just as deep as his own. On the 3rd morning, Clara was gathering eggs when she overheard 2 ranch hands riding past the north fence, men from the neighboring Dawson place. They didn't see her through the barn wall, but she heard every word. "Crowe hired help now," one snorted. "Man can't run a ranch alone if his heart's rotted out." "Heart never rotted," the other said. "It burned. Heard he ain't been the same since his wife died. Some folks say he used to be a killer of men before he played at ranching." Clara tightened her grip on the bucket. "Doesn't matter," the first replied. "A man who forgets how to feel is of no use to anyone. Ranch or not." Their voices faded as they rode on, but Clara stood rigid, red creeping into her cheeks. She marched across the yard, found Elias repairing a fence board, and planted herself squarely in front of him. "You know what folks say about you?" she demanded. Elias didn't look up. "Don't pay mind to talk." "Well, I do." Her voice sharpened. "They think you're broken. They think you're done. They think this place is dying because you've already buried yourself with it." His hammer stilled midair. Clara softened, breath leveling. "I don't believe them." Elias finally lifted his gaze. For a moment, she saw the truth, the flicker of anger, not at her, but at the world that shaped them both. But the moment broke when distant hoofbeats echoed across the plains. Not the casual rhythm of neighbors, not the heavy pulse of freight haulers. This was sharper, faster, predatory. Elias straightened, listening with a seriousness Clara had never seen on him. From the rise to the south, a line of riders appeared like shadows stretched by the setting sun. 6 men in black dusters, their horses kicking up a dark trail that slithered behind them like smoke from a dying fire. Clara's breath hitched. "Who are they?" Elias didn't answer. His jaw clenched, his stance hardened, and in his eyes, something old and lethal sparked awake. The riders slowed near the ranch, never stepping foot past the edge of Elias's land. One of them, a tall figure with a cruel slant to his shoulders, tipped his hat with a smirk that carried across distance like a knife. Clara felt her skin go cold. Elias said nothing until the riders turned back toward the canyon. "They're testing the land," he muttered. "Testing me? Why?" she asked quietly. He hesitated, voice dropping to a grave whisper. "Because they remember who I was before I became this." That night, when Clara found a wooden plank nailed to the front gate, her stomach twisted. Carved into it with a Bowie knife were 3 words burned deep into the grain. "We didn't forget," and every soul in town would later swear. That was the moment the legend of Elias Crowe began stirring from its grave. The townsfolk would say later that the air changed that night, that even the crickets dared not sing, and the moon itself hid behind clouds as if afraid to witness what was coming. At Crowe Ranch, the silence felt like a held breath, stretched tight across the wide, empty plains. Clara found Elias standing alone by the corral, lantern light carving his shadow long and sharp across the dust. He held a shovel in one hand, and at his feet lay a long, narrow bundle wrapped in an oilskin cloth. It looked like something meant to stay buried. But he wasn't burying it. He was digging it up. Clara stepped closer. "Elias, what is that?" He didn't answer at first. He lifted the bundle from the earth with careful, almost reverent hands and unwrapped it. The lantern flame flickered against the polished metal of an old rifle, long-barreled, custom-tooled, deadly in its silence. Clara felt her breath slow. "That's no ranch gun." "No," Elias said quietly. "It ain't." He sat on the edge of the feeding trough, checking the sights, the way a man checks an old heartbeat to see if it still remembers the rhythm. His face, a mask of stone for years, showed cracks now, memories leaking through. "Before this place, before my wife, I wasn't just a rancher." He paused, the words tasting like dust. "I worked for the government. Scout, sharpshooter. They trained me to track, to kill, to vanish. Called us ghost riders behind closed doors." Clara didn't blink. "And those men today, they knew you from back then? They knew me from the worst of it." His voice dropped lower, darker. Cain Burrell served in the same division. But he turned outlaw when the wars ended. Took some of the others with him. They're killers now. Organized. Ruthless. "And they're coming here?" Clara asked. He didn't say yes. He didn't have to. Lightning flashed across the horizon, brushing the desert in a pale, trembling glow. Storm clouds rolled above them, heavy as iron kettles. Elias closed his eyes and exhaled. "I left that life. Tried to bury every piece of it. When my wife died, I didn't just lose her. I lost the man I was. Part of me wanted the riders to never find me again. But they did," Clara whispered. He nodded. For a long moment, the only sound was the restless wind curling around them. Clara stepped closer, her boots crunching softly in the dirt. "You're wrong about one thing," she said gently. You didn't lose the man you were. You just locked him away. And maybe it's time he came back. Elias looked at her, really looked, and the worn grief in his eyes shifted, replaced by something sharper. Purpose. Fire. A spark rekindled by a woman who refused to yield. You should leave, he murmured. The riders won't spare you. Clara's expression hardened with quiet steel. I'm not going anywhere, Elias. I've buried a husband. I've hunted the man who killed him. And I can handle a gun better than most cowhands out here. Elias blinked, surprised. Clara stepped into the lantern light, shadows falling behind her like wings. You're not the only one with a past. And somewhere in that dark, storm-thick sky, thunder rumbled, like the world itself acknowledging the two unlikely warriors rising from their grief. Dawn broke like a blade that morning, sharp, cold, and painted in blood-orange light. The storm had passed, but the land felt no safer for it. Even the horses stood rigid in their stalls, ears pinned, nostrils flaring toward the open plains. Elias and Clara stepped out onto the porch just as the first echoes of hooves rolled across the earth. 20 riders, 20 shadows cutting across the rising sun. The Black Mesa Riders fanned out in a half circle, their dusters flapping like ravens' wings. At their center rode Cain Burrell, his grin carved cruel and deep beneath a scar that ran from eye to jaw. Crowe, he called, voice booming across the yard. Thought you could bury your past? Thought you could hide behind a woman and a broken ranch? Elias stepped forward, rifle resting easy in his hands. No tremor, no doubt. The man who had forgotten how to feel was gone. The one who remembered, who had survived blood and war, stood in his place. You rode here looking for a ghost, Elias said. But I'm still alive. Cain laughed, spit landing in the dust. Let's see for how long. His men shifted, hands drifting toward their holsters. But before a single gun cleared leather, a crisp, controlled click snapped through the silence. Clara Mayfield stepped beside Elias, revolver leveled, stance steady as bedrock. Cain's grin faltered. And what's this? A housewife with a pistol. Clara's voice cut sharper than any bullet. My husband was a lawman. He taught me to shoot straight. I only miss when I want. A ripple of unease passed through the riders. Cain snarled. Kill them both. The world exploded into gunfire. Elias moved with a deadly grace, every shot placed with surgical precision. Clara covered his flank, firing with the confidence of someone who'd learned to survive long before fate led her to this ranch. Smoke thickened around them, swirling with dust and firelight. One rider fell, then another, then 5 more in rapid succession. Panic broke through the gang like a stampede gone wild. Cain tried to flee, spurring his horse hard, but Elias was faster. Their eyes met across the chaos, two histories colliding in a heartbeat. Cain fired first. He missed. Elias didn't. The outlaw king toppled from his saddle, hitting the ground with a thud that ended years of cruelty. Silence fell. The remaining riders scattered into the hills, swallowed by the very dust they once commanded. When it was over, Clara lowered her gun with a trembling breath. Elias turned to her, something new and long lost, flickering in his eyes. Not just gratitude, not just relief. Hope. The old storyteller always ends it the same way. And from that day on, the frontier spoke of them not as a broken rancher and a wandering widow, but as two souls who reminded each other how to live, how to fight, and how to love in a land that tried to forget them.